Hey guys, so this is what we want to talk about today is VR, backend, Rails v serverless.
Froth or future.
Yeah, that. See if this works. Okay, so as you said, I'm Janet.
I'm Ram.
We're from Autoscaling Studios. We have a full stack development studio in San Francisco. We develop VR and AR products for clients. We also train and teach VR and AR, and we also have a game on the Steam store in early access, go check it out, live in color. So big fans of VR. So what we wanted to talk about today is a journey that we went through relatively recently with a client. We had a client come to us very, very technically astute, which is always a blessing and a curse, right? Who was determined that we would use serverless as the back end for the VR app that we were building for them. And spoiler alert, we went with Ruby on Rails, not serverless. Woo! Exactly. So we thought that that journey was quite interesting and something that would be interesting to the room today. So what we're going to talk about today is a bit around the hype, right, that's around all of this. Virtual reality and serverless at a kind of 10,000-foot view so that we can have a good conversation around it. The problem and use case that we faced, how we solved it, and how we thought through Rails versus serverless as that back end. And then what we think the future is and what we hope the future is, okay, for that. So first up, trying really hard not to turn this talk into a buzzword bingo experience. I feel like if we'd thrown in a bit of Elixir and millennials into the title, we could have hit every buzzword this conference has got. So hold us to that. If we're using too many buzzwords, we want to kind of bring this down into reality. So hype number one. As you can see here, this is Conan O'Brien going crazy on television, experiencing the HTC Vive for the first time. He was in Job Simulator, which is one of the launch titles for the HTC Vive. And we may have people in this room on either side of this hype, right? You might be in the, this is the next Blu-ray, this is beta to VHS, this is going nowhere. You might be on the side of, this is amazing, the world's never going to be the same, VR, AR is changing the world. I think the one thing we can agree on is there is a hell of a lot of hype around it at the moment, and so kind of getting underneath it is quite helpful. So in terms of what we were looking at for our client, we were looking at 6DoF, 6 degree of freedom, PC-based, apparently audio feedback-based, virtual reality. So that's the HTC Vive and the Oculus Rift, as modeled by our wonderful Ram here. It usually involves the HMD, head-mounted display unit, which is what gives you that immersive world that you're in, but then also 2 hand controllers, which allows you to physically interact with that space and move around forward, back, X, Y, and Z. And now that Oculus has joined the world of actually moving around, we have touch controllers for Oculus too, which is awesome. Of note, we didn't consider console-based VR, most notably PlayStation VR, which has a big install base, but is only front-facing, so the cameras don't allow you to kind of have backward movement. And we weren't looking at 3DoF or 3 degree of freedom mobile. We will touch on mobile and the Google Daydream later, though. So just to kind of ground us in what we were looking at. So hype number 2 that we were looking at was serverless. And in this super high-res clip from YouTube that you can see here, this is Tim Wagner, kind of the AWS godfather, taking to an old school server with a baseball bat at the first serverless conference in New York. We were there. It was hot in a small warehouse in New York, but we were there for serverless. And again, serverless, I was talking to Iman earlier, right, who works with serverless a lot, and it's kind of becoming one of those things where the promise of serverless is amazing, right? Auto-scaling, lower cost, pay-per execution. And so it's becoming one of those things where a lot of people are like, serverless, just throw serverless at it, it's an answer. And that's kind of what we were facing a little bit.
I was reminded of that yesterday when Marcos Matos talked about like solution number 2, I think he had, which is throw more servers into the problem until it doesn't work anymore. Yeah. We'll hopefully convince you that this is a little different.
So what is serverless?
Yeah, so first of all, it's not a world in which there are no servers, right? So basically what we're talking about, you see the classic 3-tier application that we all know and love, right? Using Rails, et cetera. What we're talking about is abstracting this into a different set of layers. First of all, browsers, in terms of having a more rich, kind of think of SPAs, et cetera, rich client, right? And then abstracting away all the core, non-core services to something else. So for example, the authentication service or the product database here. The most common examples that are used in serverless right now are Auth0 for the authentication, for the product is Firebase, right? And then basically abstracting everything to an API gateway and this is the term that Lambda has or AWS has. It's the equivalent for all the rest of the products. And what we're talking right there is having small bits of single responsibility kind of logic where you are just abstracting that to that very core set of logic that you need. That is basically going and doing that logic and then firing off to someone else. In this case, what I'm talking about, by the way, is serverless as a backend versus, basically going and serverless as kind of an event engine or
As glue.
as glue. Thank you. And so that's what we're using this function, but both are viable. And when people talk about FAS or function as a service, they're talking about the serverless as glue part.
Yeah. So unlike some of the Twitter trolling you'll see, serverless is not the imaginary world where we auto-magically preserve state without any server in the universe. It's essentially outsourcing all of that server work to a third party, which manages provisions and so on and so forth. Okay? So we walk in, and our client wants, and here's where I'm about to play buzzword bingo, but the client wants a multi-user, real-time, collaborative, virtual reality application that they can run in multiple different locations that allows them to all kind of interact with various objects and so on and so forth. So how do you do that? Essentially, you need to think about 3 layers in VR. So first up, you've got your first layer, which is really your game engine. And if we talk a lot about gaming, it's because a lot of the power and the physics engines that VR relies on to create this immersive world with gravity comes out of the gaming industry, right? So essentially your game engine, either Unity or Unreal, really delivers you physics, analytics, and your engine to do it. But then that's only going to have my client experience in my headset. Ram's going to be over there in his headset experiencing the same thing but completely separately. If we want to be in the same virtual space, throwing objects to each other, moving things around, we need to create a connectivity. And that's going to be your second layer. So this creates a connective layer. It allows for representation of objects simultaneously in the correct orientation, in the right places, so that we're kind of working together. And it delivers you a server or P2P to do that. Typically, you can use Unity networking, which is built in. It doesn't have a lot, but it can get you started. Photon and Photon Unity networking is really the standard at the moment for that. Or you can roll your own, apparently, with a power tool. You can also use Ulink or some others, but Photon's really the standard. And then you actually, surprisingly, need a third layer, and that's for persistence. Because the game engines allow a little bit of persistence, but not a lot. So when I exit my session, if I want to hold on to all the preferences I made in my room, in all of my objects, all my settings, right, it's really hard to hold on to that. You can kind of put a JSON blob, but if you want to do complex information and so forth, you actually need to bolt on a kind of persistence third layer. And that's where our client was really excited about serverless, because this is an app that's going to go kind of enterprise-wide and has a massive kind of scale-up considered. But again, spoiler alert, we ended up going with Rails because it really delivered what we needed, and that was a surprise to all of us. So trying to bring this down to a problem that's quite real and that we can all kind of grapple with. I was like, how do I do this? Because we can't share, obviously, the details of this client's problem. But I'm like, look, what really brings this to life in a way that has multiple users in virtual reality, all moving objects around together and interacting at the same time, and really pays homage to Melbourne? And of course, that is...
I still vote for baseball.
Yeah, well, we're in Australia now, which is awesome. Cricket. So imagine, if you will, we're all going to create a virtual reality cricket game, right? So our first layer in the game engine, we're going to put as much static environment in there as we can. Side note, if you want to create a really immersive experience, you want to aim ideally for at least 100 FPS or frames per second. That is really hard to do on current equipment. You're counting your verts, your tries, you're back to kind of really early days of development, trying to keep everything low. So anything you can throw into that static environment gets put into a global mesh, and it really helps with your compute power. So let's put the MCG in our static environment, right? Our game logic is going to sit there. So you hit the boundary with a ball, you get 4 points. It goes over the boundary, you get 6 points, okay? That all sits in level 1. But then I need to see Ram in his HMD, okay? When he bowls at me, I need to see it, and when the ball comes, I need to interact with it and hit it back. All of that, the interactables, our avatars, that all has to live in our second kind of communication layer. And then third layer, just think about stats, leaderboards, player, and so on and so forth, okay? So what did we go with? We went with Unity and C#. Unity has about 45% currently of the game market, so it is the leader. If you are working with, say, Lucasfilm, or you want super high-res images, you'll probably be working with Unreal, okay? We went with Photon. It is really robust. It's kind of proven and worked well for our enterprise client. And as we said, we went with Rails, not serverless.
Yeah, so I mean, look, we got what we needed with Rails, basically, right? When we're talking about, you guys have used webhooks, use a Rails server to kind of get the notifications, et cetera, and then to surface the notifications using Rails API and the action cable. The testing infrastructure is good. And also, when we're talking about this, I was reminded of Pjort's talk.
Pjort.
Thank you.
Ramakrishnan.
In terms of building, we actually had to go through the exercise of building SQL via DSL here, right? Because we were integrating with another database that our client had, which was a major pain, but Rails and the infrastructure, and Ruby in particular, infrastructure around that helped us. A few other notes around some of this stuff. This reminds someone, there was a great talk yesterday about open source and the free rider problem. Unity and these guys don't necessarily have that because there's an asset store. Then actually you can buy basically software that you can modify to your heart's content and use. That's another major use of Unity and why it's gotten such market share. Two things on here, other than OpenWhisk is actually open source by IBM, so you can actually host it on your own machines. And there's a little bit of confusion between serverless, the concept, versus tooling around it. So there's a product that was called JAWS that's now called serverless, and that's brilliant on their behalf. But basically, there's a bunch of tools like that, Apex, Chalice by Amazon, which basically makes the tooling around serverless, the concept, or each of the vendor stacks easier.
Cool. So what we went through with the client was a kind of consideration of when does serverless make sense, when does Rails make sense? And while what we're about to take you through is our decision for this use case, and we're not pretending to have the answer be all and end all, this is the Bible when you use serverless, we think the consideration factors that we took into account are the factors any of us would need to look at if we're thinking about serverless. And with all of this hype, more and more of us, I think, are going to be asked, why isn't this on serverless? Why can't we? And so I think some of the things that we thought about was first up scale. Like we said, because a third-party provider is provisioning all of the server space for you, you can auto-scale. You never have decision points. You never have to decide whether to put on another 2 million. Like, you never have to make those decisions, which is great if you've got unanticipated growth.
Yeah, but it doesn't come without cost, right? For example, you can't have long-lived functions here, right? They have to be 5 minutes or less. You can have about 1,000 instances without talking to Amazon of a function, right? So you don't have unlimited growth, so you actually have to deal with that. The other thing is cold starts, right? These are container-based, so when you're sitting there with a container, it's just like any other container-based system. The first time you hit it, you have that startup time associated with it, right? So none of this is, problems that are completely incomprehensible to you guys, but there are limitations.
Yeah. But related to that auto-scaling, right, there's a huge cost advantage, right? Because you only pay per execution, so you don't pay for any dormant server, right? And we've all seen the stats, 80% of servers worldwide are comatose, and we're all paying for them. So again, this is why I think more and more we're seeing clients coming to us being like, serverless is the answer. And in some cases it is, but for this client, it wasn't.
Well, especially when you have peak loads that are uneven or unexpected.
Another consideration is community, right? We're all here at RubyConf. I started out in the Ruby community, and it's my first love, as we said. And this is a really large, really open community. There's a huge amount of free open source software, as we saw yesterday. And that's actually a really real consideration if you think about extensibility and kind of moving over other things.
Right. But look, there are also strengths in the smaller community. Pretty much the first serverless conference, by the way, it's run by a guy called A Cloud Guru, which is a Melbourne company. And they, I think, sponsor the serverless groups here and in Sydney, is that it's a smaller ship. You can pretty much know everybody in it. If you have a particular concern, et cetera, you can probably bubble it up a little bit more since there are less people, because they're, quite frankly, looking for converts.
Testing is another really big concern, right? We all know and love the Ruby and Rails testing environment. You've got huge ability to do system and unit testing. You've got Capybara, all sorts of things. Serverless is a different beast. You can do great unit testing for each of those individual functions that you've taken out. You can unit test to your heart's content. But imagine now you've got this massive distributed system with all sorts of third-party providers. How do you do full system-wide testing? That isn't built out yet, and for our client, that was a huge issue.
Yeah, so, just even think about developing, right? You sit there with a Rails app, you're doing localhost, it's fine, you're pushing it to whatever else, whatever problems you have, you don't have them until you're actually pushing them up, although there are some. But here you're sitting there and you have to go from the DevOps environment first. Like, how do you go and do integration testing? How do you go and stub out some of the services that you're depending on that are provided by AWS? Are you built for that if you actually use the services, right? So if you want to go and actually think about how you do testing, this is a vast and complicated world that the tooling is certainly not as rich as a Rails environment.
Yeah, not undoable by any stretch, but it's a big undertaking. Another big concern would be control, right? You move to serverless, suddenly you're on multi-tenancy. You don't know who you're sharing servers with. You have to become really good at managing SLAs, and you're on the receiving end of SLAs. So when you're handing out SLAs to others, there's question marks around that, and you're also on a public cloud. There's a lot greater control that you can rest in Ruby, and that was a huge issue for our client because this was dealing with a lot of consumer data, a lot of research data, proprietary stuff that they just were not comfortable outsourcing.
I think you said it all.
Complexity is another concern. Ron was talking about it earlier. In order to do serverless, you're pushing a lot of the logic into the client, into the front end, so it can interact. Whereas with Ruby and Rails, we know it's all sitting on the server. It's in our controllers, and that's something, again, the client was set up for, they were really comfortable with, and it wasn't something that their dev team was about to kind of retool around.
I think the trends, I mean, again, we talk about SPAs, rise rich clients, but there are cases where it won't work for you in terms of having that rich client.
And another thing to think about is configuration. Rails is all built in. You've got environment variables, bundler, all sorts of things. It's really mixed in serverless, and so there's an extent to which you're going to be DIYing some of this. And then monitoring is a really big issue, right? You can see here, right? If your vendor monitors what you want, that arrow hits home and you're set. You've got all the analytics, all the monitoring you want. But if it's not on the dashboard, then you're in trouble, right? Whereas Rails, you've got so many robust alternatives. You can't get to it one way, you can find another way around to monitor, analyze what you want. And this was really kind of the deciding factor for our client in this one.
Yeah, I mean, you can also say this is a kind of offshoot of vendor lock-in, et cetera. But basically, if the vendor doesn't open up APIs for different providers, you're kind of stuck with what the vendor gives you, right? And they're fast-moving, et cetera. But you have to balance the two. And certainly, the options are not as rich as in the Rails environment for monitoring.
And then lastly, when are you not going to think about skills when you're developing? But you want to think about kind of where the skills sit. And as you move to a serverless environment, you can have this great polyglot engineering team, everybody handling individual functions with different languages, and it works. But then you need to be very good at managing that kind of a distributed group and a distributed system. Whereas if you're running Rails, you need people with framework depth. And again, we had somebody very key that was a real champion that was a kind of Rails aficionado. So it made a lot of sense in this instance to keep with the Rails stack.
And we have slightly different opinions on this because when I look at this, I think it's just a different skill set in getting acclimatized to this, right? Knowing events, knowing message buses, because this is always a kind of asynchronous world. You could use things like Kinesis streams. Simple notification service doesn't work with Lambda right now, but these solutions are coming. But really, when you're talking about this, we're talking about a different way of looking at this from a distributed systems perspective rather than framework complexity, right? The other part about this to also mention is, and this is kind of what we're planning on this is not an all or nothing with serverless, right? One of the great benefits or aspects when we're looking at this is that you can take certain portions of this, think of how you did microservices, if you did that evolution, et cetera, and move parts of that system over and see how they work. And for certain event-driven kind of subsystems that we're looking at, we're certainly looking at moving that over, not wholesale, but piecemeal.
And that's what we're looking at with this client as we kind of expand this out. But look, in the couple of minutes we have left, you'd be forgiven for thinking we're super negative on serverless, right? We're like, Rails is the only way to go. That's not at all it. And we're here at RubyConf, not at RailsConf. So as we look forward and we look to the Daydream, which is an incredibly rich mobile VR experience. If you haven't tried it, I highly recommend it.
By the way, all this is a phone with a headset.
Right. And is significant leap ahead from where VR has been and so forth. And you look at some of these crazy kind of statistics looking forward. Even if you only believe a very small amount of this, right? We are looking at a massive scale up in VR and all around the mobile headset space, right? So how do we start preparing for it? Because it isn't economical for us to start provisioning servers. It isn't economical for us to start building out for this. But serverless is a really great way, we think, to deal with some of these spikes. And for those of us in the audience that are working for fantastic startups that are facing unexpected growth spurts or going into new areas, serverless is a really great option. And so I think just as we finish, we've got, because I think we're out of time, we've got just a couple of thoughts here, which is really a call to action and a bit of a kind of invitation, if you will. Is that fair?
That's right.
And I think the first one is, we really think serverless is a fantastic opportunity for Ruby to live beyond Rails. We would love to be able to use serverless with Ruby as our language working with it, but that isn't supported today.
Right. And this is part of, we think it will be. It's certainly, you could see the interest from AWS, but even think about it. If the 500 people in this room or at this conference had voted in this poll, we might have had to.
We could have changed the future, people.
Yes, indeed. But what we're saying is, first of all, it's the same talk as Peter. Like, try this out, right? So, try some of the frameworks that I saw yesterday presented in terms of, I loved one of the phrases, which is like, this is Ruby first and then a web framework, right? When you're abstracting this, doing single responsibility, making Mets proud, right? This translates very well. And right now, most of what you see is people kind of jerry-rigging this and putting like JRuby, et cetera, and having these problems where it's not entirely integrated into the stack. Talk to your vendor. Some of the CTOs in this room as well, put this in your roadmap. But also just try the use cases for which this makes sense for you, right?
Yeah. And the last one is really a bit of an invitation, right? VR is cool, people. No, it's really, really fun, right? And if you haven't tried it, please come find us or find the guys from REA Group, who very kindly have got the Daydream and the Vive up here. We've got a Rift with us. We'd love to get as many people in VR experiencing it as possible. But also think about developing it. If any of you have thought about just doing this on the weekend, it's really not that hard to get into. Unity is super accommodating. And you can code in C#. And having come from a Ruby background, I actually found Ruby incredibly helpful in approaching C#. The single responsibilities, the hierarchies, the sense of kind of object orientation, it's hugely helpful. Now, there's some differences, right? Statically typed versus dynamically, but more similarities than differences. So I would love for some of this great Ruby community feeling to come across into VR. And so hit us up. We would love to bring as many people into the community as we can.
And we haven't even talked about, some of the other aspects of this is, VR on the web, right? There are frameworks like A-Frame, et cetera, where you can try VR in the browser. So these worlds are converging sooner rather than later. For example, Facebook's for whatever F number it is at this point, is released. You see there's React VR, some bindings like that. So these worlds, even in your regular day job, might converge faster than you think. So check it out to see what you think. And the same way that, I echo her sentiments, like the Ruby community has given a lot to us. We'd love more people to come in. And yes, sir, please talk to us if you want to know more.
So with that, thank you so much for your time today. It was really great.